Hey everyone, welcome to our small footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. I've got a couple of lots of notes worth of videos to do, so if you haven't watched before, what I tend to do is I do all the filming, and then over the next however long it takes me, I write out a whole bunch of notes, and then I come out here and I do the voiceovers for the videos all at once. It's just the way it works in my schedule, and it means though that I do a couple of voiceovers at a time, same clothing, same setting, and everyone just has to deal with it. So I've got 3 videos worth here, but it's getting quite late, so I don't know whether I'll get all 3 done, but I'll at least get the first one done so that I can get this video out tomorrow. So what I did was I was putting together a what we eat in a week, because everyone really likes those videos, and realized that I couldn't do that until I did the last couple of meal prep videos. So out here we shop every 6 weeks, and after that 6-weekly shop I do a run of videos, sort of a series each month, that shows you how we use, process, preserve, whatever, the food that we buy, because that's what people were most interested in. People really wanted to know, if I only shopped every 6 weeks, how we managed to make it work. So as a side note, we're family of 8, as I said, 6 kids ranging from 7 through to 16, and we live on 20 acres. Darryl and I both work from home. The kids are homeschooled, so we're home 24/7. All the food we do is predominantly from scratch, and it's done from that 6-week shop. So we buy all our meat and personal goods and everything else in that 6-week shop, and we make it last. All our fruit and veg as well. Now, obviously, towards the end of the 6 weeks, we eat a lot of frozen veg or canned veg or that sort of thing, because the fresh isn't going to last the 6 weeks. Cabbages have a tendency to last 6 weeks, so long as we store them appropriately. And some apples and oranges, depending on the season. Like if I'm buying in-season oranges or in-season apples, if they're stored appropriately, will last the whole 6 weeks. Carrots sometimes as well. It really just varies. But what most people were interested in was how I make it work, what I do with it, and all that sort of thing. So that's what these meal prep videos are for. So this is the last this one's the second last video on the meal prep for the shopping that was done in June. So I'm actually due to go shopping again in 2 weeks. It flies, man. That 6 weeks feels like forever and no time at all. So I'm due to do groceries again in 2 weeks, which will be another 6 weeks worth. So video today, I'm still getting through the meat and stuff, so I'm a little bit behind on getting these videos out. This is a week or 2 ago. Normally I try and get them done a lot quicker than that, but I've been a bit stretched this month, but it's actually working out quite well, because I'm putting them out every couple of days with some other videos in between, and it's giving me that whole 6 weeks worth of content for you guys. So I think it works quite well that way too. As always, any feedback, please just leave it in the comments, because I'm making these videos for you guys, so what you think about it is important. So enjoy watching this one, and I'll see you at the end. So this month I've been a little bit lucky in scoring some extra meat throughout the month. I have a friend who lives local who was at the Food Assist in Toowoomba, I believe. And Food Assist is very similar to A4 Community Care. It's a food hampery type place that does a similar sort of thing. You purchase the hampers through them. I don't think I've ever been to Food Assist. I've been to Loaves and Fishes in Toowoomba, but I don't think I've ever been to Food Assist. But she was going there, and they occasionally have extras that you can purchase. So at this particular trip, they had a 12-kilo box of frozen chicken tenderloins for $30, which is really cheap for chicken at the moment. Chicken is really expensive. Angie was able to purchase me a box. I had to send her my proof of address and that sort of thing, because it's one per family in the area. But she was able to purchase me a box of those and bring them home. So very grateful for that, to add to what we had. I put it in an esky to defrost for a couple of days because it was frozen. We've only got one fridge that's working properly at the moment, and properly is being generous. So I put the chicken in one of our eskies. We have the high-end eskies that are supposed to keep things frozen for 7 days, so it works really well. It means it defrosts over a couple of days at a really cold temperature. I've got a temperature gauge to check it too, so that's what I did. Once it started defrosting, I started using it. So the outside edges that defrosted first, I used up this particular day, and then as the rest of it defrosted, I used the rest of it. So the first thing I decided to do with some of it was to make some chicken pie filling, so like a chicken pot pie filling type thing. I made up some pastry initially. I do a short crust pastry that it's taken me a long time to master, but I'm really happy with how it works now. It is a lard and olive oil mixed pastry. It's 400 grams of flour, 110 grams of iced water, 60 grams of olive oil, and 60 grams of lard with a pinch of salt. You bring it together in a food processor, or I use my Thermomix, until it is in sort of crumbs, and then you tip it out onto a dough mat and bring it all together into discs. That's enough for a top and a bottom pie crust, so you don't want to overwork it. You just want to bring it together into sort of disc shape so that it's easier for rolling out. Once it's in a disc, I stick it in a Ziploc bag in the fridge, ready to use over the next day or so. It can sit in the fridge for a couple of days. There's nothing in it that's going to go bad, and it can be frozen as well. I did a bunch of Googling, some of my favourite sort of sites, you know, Recipe 10 Eats, Marion's Kitchen, all that sort of thing, and had a quick look at all different options for making this sort of a thing. And I decided that because tenderloins can sometimes be a little tough and they have that little bit of gristle in them that I wasn't willing to sit there and pull out, I was going to poach them first. So I did a bit of a stock with coconut cream and some salt and some pepper. I brought it up to a simmer, and once I had it at a simmer, I added the tenderloins. I used a bit of the Vegeta stock powder in there too because I didn't have liquid stock. I did use some of that stock, the stock pots that we got in the hamper, the little gelatinous stock flavorings. Used what we had anyway, and then poached the chicken in it. So brought it up to a sim. You don't want to take it to a full boil because milk has a tendency to like froth up and overflow if you take it to a boil. So you just want it sort of a nice good simmer. Then I placed a couple of kilo of the chicken tenders into it and brought it back up to the simmer so that I could simmer it for a good sort of 15 minutes. It doesn't matter if the chicken's not completely cooked through because we're going to be putting it in pie filling, so it's going to be cooked again. But you want it, you know, majority cooked sort of thing. So I did that. While that was simmering, I got started on the rest of the pie filling. So I cooked off some onion and some ghee. I diced up some carrots. I added some garlic and celery to the onion, and then all the diced carrot as well. I was generous with the carrot because I sort of wanted to pad this out, this sort of filling out to fill a few pies. I pulled the chicken out of the liquid and I cut it up into chunks. So you could put it whole if you wanted, and then break it up when you're cooking the soup, the mix. But I thought it was the easiest thing was just to cut it all up into chunks. So I just roughly cut it all up to put it in the pot. After the onion and the garlic and stuff are cooked, I deglazed the veg in the pan with a bit of chicken stock. If you had wine, you could use wine. I have cooking wine sometimes and not other times. And then I sprinkled some flour over the top of the vegetable to act as like a thickener. So it's sort of going to be a bit like a roux, that flour and fat and chicken stock sort of a mix. Slowly started adding in the poaching liquid from the chicken. So we're using that coconut cream stock poaching liquid in the pie filling. So I started ladling that into the mix and stirring it so that I could cook off that flour a little bit. Again, a bit like using a white sauce, a bit like making a roux. And then once the pot was about half full, I added in the chicken and then a kilo of frozen corn kernels. I added a bit more liquid as needed. I don't want to overdo the liquid though because that corn is going to release some juices into there as well. So it's going to have some water and stuff that it's going to release into that sauce. So you want to go a little bit less is more here in the added liquid. I also added some really big handfuls of the baby spinach. I had bought that on the monthly grocery trip, and so I found that if I buy the baby spinach by the box in the fresh box from the fruit and veg store, it's only been at the fruit and veg store for a day or two, generally speaking. It's coming straight out of their cold room and then traveling and putting straight in the fridge in the box, that it will last me a good few weeks. Like I'm talking 3 weeks. It'll still be usable. The bottom gets a little bit sludgy towards the very end of it, and that's when you know you can't use it anymore if I haven't used it all up. But the ducks really enjoy baby spinach, so I tend to just, once it gets to that point, I give it to them. So I have been trying to find a few different ways to use it, and using it in a variety of things to try and get the most out of it. So I put a couple of really big handfuls of baby spinach in this mix because it's not going to detract from anything if it's just going to add nutrition in the end. Green and colour, pretty green colour. So as with most pie fillings, you want this to chill before you're filling a pie to cook. So we won't be using this tonight for dinner. So all I did was I cooked it all up. I put the lid on it, let it cool to cooler because I don't want it to heat up the fridge before sticking it in the fridge for use later on. The next thing I moved on to was one of the pork roasts. So I cut off the rind and then chunked up the pork. So I sliced up all the rind because we do this, anyone who's watched before knows that we do this every month. We cut up the rind, we put potatoes in a tray. I love these classic enamel coated cast iron trays. Surreal had washed and chopped some potatoes for me, so I put the potatoes in the bottom of the tray. When she does it, it always looks nice and neat. When I put potatoes in the bottom of the tray, I just toss them in. But anyway, so she did that for me. And then we put all the pork rind over the top. I spray the pork rind with a little bit of oil just to get it going when it first goes in the oven, and then a bit of oil and a bit of salt as well. And then we bake it. You want to bake it at a really high heat, sort of 220, nice and hot. And it works really well in the wood stove when you've got the wood stove running. I didn't have the wood stove running today, so I just stuck it in the barbecue, which works fine. It's just that it's using gas, whereas, you know, timber's free. So I put that in the barbecue to cook. It makes perfect baked roast potatoes. The rind snacks, the kids eat them. I can't eat the rind snacks. My face is too bad to eat rind, but the kids really enjoy them, and if we don't eat them all, the dogs get them as cold chewy snacks the next day. So, or I grind them up for using in things if they're cooked enough. If they've got too much fat in them, I won't grind them up because they can go rancid, but if they're dried out enough, then I will grind them up to use in crumbs and things like that. But we have plenty of the leftover cracklings from when I rendered the last lot of lard, and I think we'll find that we'll have plenty of those between each time we've rendered the lard, because we're down to about 3 or 4 jars of lard. It lasted us around about the 6 months, and we've still got cracklings in the fridge, and we're going to have to do another set of lard soon. So anyway, so we keep all the fat that's rendered from the cooking the potatoes too. We scrape that out of the tray or pour it out of the tray if it's still hot, and we use that for cooking in as well. So cooking veggies in that pork fat's really tasty like it is in the potatoes. So we do that. The rest of the pork I decided to mince up for various uses. I ran it through the coarse grinding plate like I always do. I don't use the fine grinding plate unless I'm making sausages. I always use the coarse grinding plate because that's how we prefer it. I use the Luvele grinder. You've seen it a lot this month because I've used it a lot this month, and it works really well. It takes like a minute per kilo of meat. It runs it through really nice and cleanly, and it's really easy to clean, really easy to put together. Every time I use it, I fall in love a little bit more. So as I said, I only use the coarse one. I use the fine one if I'm filling sausages, that's all. So I pulled about 2 kilos of the pork, minced pork out to season with breakfast sausage style seasoning, you know, brown sugar, smoked paprika, ground cloves, sage, garlic powder, salt and pepper, that kind of flavouring. And then I brought it all together fairly roughly. So again, I wanted to emulsify this a little bit for how we're going to use it. So I worked it with my hands a little bit so that it has that little bit of emulsification. And gave it a good massage to get those flavours in there as well. I also mixed up some sourdough overnight English muffin dough for the next day. So I just did it in my KitchenAid. I bring the dough together in the KitchenAid. It's got a little bit of kefir in it. It's a slightly enriched dough, and then I brought it inside where it's warmer, fed my starters and put them aside as well to use for the next day or whenever I use them. They go in the fridge if I don't use them straight away, and the dough for the English muffins goes inside. For dinner I went really simple. I cooked up a bunch of the breakfast seasoned sausage, so the brown sugar and sage sausage. I mixed some spinach through to wilt it because again I'm using this, I want to use as much of this spinach up as possible before it goes bad. The animals will eat anything that goes bad, but I buy this food for us, so as much as I'm happy to feed it to the animals in the end, I'd much prefer that we ate it. So I put a couple of handfuls of spinach through to wilt it. I sprinkled it with some gravy powder, and then I used some milk kefir to turn it into a sort of a sausage gravy. Now, of course, most sausage gravies are a white gravy, just using flour. I use a mix of flour and the gravy powder just because we like that flavour of it. So I served that over the potatoes that we'd roasted under the pork rind for dinner. Super simple, super tasty, not necessarily the healthiest meal in the world, but it was just pleasant to have. The next day I started off with the English muffin dough. I don't bother with circles. I really just couldn't be bothered with it, to be honest. I just cut it all into a grid of squares. The kids don't care, and it saves me re-rolling the dough because overhandling re-rolling the dough is not ideal anyway. Sometimes I totally stuff up the cutting, mind you, and end up with some weirdly varying sizes, but again, no one cares, so it doesn't really matter. I always try to cut it out into an even number of squares so that everyone gets has the option of the amount that they want and things like that. But in general, I just chop it all up into squares. And I find using the pizza cutter works quite well, or just a dough cutter works fine for that. A bit of semolina on the dough mat and on the top of them helps them not to stick to each other and gives them a little bit of crunch as well. I cook them off in the cast iron in batches with a lid on. So there's a bit of semolina on them from where they were rolled out, which, as I said, adds to the crunch. It is easy to end up with some really dark spots on these at times. I did put these in my stories and someone complained that they looked burned. They definitely have dark spots on them. It's sort of the nature of the way that they are cooked. You have to have the pan hot enough that they puff up, that they create that steam in the middle and puff up. So you have to be careful with your timing and that to not burn them as well. But I find that they have a bit of honey and stuff in them, so they caramelize, so they kind of look burnt sometimes even if they aren't, but you need to judge that as to your preference on them. Take about 6 minutes each side, put them in, put the lid on, 6 minutes, take the lid off, flip them over, put the lid back on again. You can bake them in the oven on a tray, and I have done that, but they just don't quite have the same you want all those crags in the middle, and by steaming them in a cast iron pot with a lid on for that 6 minutes at high temperature, it works much better than putting them on a tray. They just do not puff up quite as much. I turned some of that breakfast sausage mince into patties to have on the English muffin. So all I did was I flattened out some chunks of the sausage and cooked it off. Now, yesterday when I had made the sausage mix up, I had cooked little chunks of it off to taste it. That's the best way to see if you like the seasoning of your sausage, is to cook a little bit of off. And if it doesn't taste real good, then add some more flavouring. So that's ideal. Now, when you do put sausage mince into sausage casings and then cook them, I do find that the flavourings end up a little bit milder. You do tend to have to go a little bit stronger than you expect when you're putting it inside sausage casings, but for this purpose it didn't really need any extra. It worked quite well. So I cooked up those sausage patties, and then everyone had them with some ketchup, eggs and cheese for some, baby spinach for some, I think it was like caramelized onion jam for some, whatever anyone wanted, mayo, doesn't really matter. I just cooked them up and put them all on a platter, and everyone helped themselves, as I do most meals. With the rest of the pork mince from the day before, I decided to make some bulk sausage rolls up. So these work really well in the freezer as well, so they can be cooked straight from frozen, or if you defrost them as well. I like to cook off a bunch of onion, celery, bacon and garlic in the cast iron first to add to my pork mince. I find that cooking it off, caramelizing that onion and stuff works really well. So I cooked all that off and then mixed it through the pork mince. I added breadcrumbs, which I believe were leftover English muffins, to be honest, because I really like using the sourdough bread as the breadcrumbs. I find it's a really light and fluffy breadcrumb, so I like to make my own if I can. Store-bought breadcrumbs I find are heavier, and they just don't give quite the same fluffy texture that sourdough or homemade breadcrumbs do. So I cooked off that, added that to the pork mince, added the breadcrumbs, as well as some salt and pepper. I used some of the mushroom salt as well, and then worked it together with a couple of eggs. I actually added some spinach as well because I had it there. Now, ideally, I should have wilted that spinach in when I cooked the bacon and that. It would have made it a whole lot easier to blend it with the mince inside the pastry, but because I didn't think about it until afterwards, I put it in raw, which is fine. It's going to be cooked in the sausage rolls. Not that you can't eat spinach raw. There is issues with oxalates and things like that. Some people have more of a tendency to have an issue with that than others. But the texture is better when it's cooked in a cooked substance. Like if it's raw in a salad, that's fine. But if it's cooked in a cooked like if you're having it in something that's cooked, it's always nicer when it's wilted. So I should have done that, but it didn't matter. It's going to be cooked again in the sausage rolls. I use store-bought puff pastry for my sausage rolls. It's not something that I find efficient to make myself. It's time-consuming for the quantity that I'm going to be making. I can make rough puff pastry pretty simply, and it does work, but it's a lot of effort, especially for the quantity that I'm making at one time. So the store-bought puff pastry, this Borg's brand, works quite well. It's dairy-free and it's got a few numbers in it, but nothing excessive, and I just find it convenient for this particular usage. I cut the pastry in half and put a line of filling down each one, and then I roll it into a log. I place the seam on the underside. So you want enough filling in there that they're full, but you don't want so much that you can't get the edges to meet. If you can't get the edges to meet, then it splits when it's cooking. So you definitely want them to overlap. So you want to make sure that there's, it's a hard one. Sometimes you put the filling in it, you try to roll them and you go, yeah, no, that's not quite right. I'm going to have to pull back on that a little bit. Sometimes it feels like not enough filling for the amount of pastry that you're going to be having, but it's just a bit of a thing you have to work with. So and it works that way. I like to cut the logs into pieces because I find it cooks better that way. There's less burning before the middle's cooked, especially in the barbecue with that excess bottom heat on it. So I slice them up and place them on the tray. As always, I can fit half a sheet and a quarter sheet in the barbecue at the same time, so that's what I fill. I give them all an egg wash. An egg beaten with a little bit of water is all I use, and sprinkle them with sesame seeds, and that's personal choice. I like sesame seeds on just about anything. A lot of the kids aren't as fond of them as me, but they can just brush them off. I like sesame seeds on my sausage rolls and on my burger buns and that sort of thing, and they can live with it or they can brush them off themselves. So I put them in the oven, and they take 20 to 30 minutes depending on your oven and that sort of thing, and how many you've got stacked in that tray, whether you're doing the whole logs, whether you're doing little ones. It's really just best to check your oven as you go, check the pastry, check the bottoms of them, and make the call there. It's a hard one to judge compared to me who's cooking on a barbecue sort of thing. The bacon had been brining in the fridge for 7 days. I've been flipping it each day in the bag to make sure that the brine is well covered, so it's ready to come out of the brine. So the next step for that is that it has to be pulled out and washed, and then once it's washed, it needs to be placed on a rack on a tray in the fridge without a cover on it, so that it can get itself a pellicle, which is basically a skin. You're letting the bacon create this external skin from being in the fridge uncovered, and that will help it to absorb smoke. That's the theory anyway. So you want to put it into the fridge to dry out, a bit like you do with sausages too. If you make your sausages, when you fill your sausage skins, you then want them to go in the fridge for 24 hours on a rack so that they can create a bit of a skin on them, that the hog casings tighten up and things like that. So it's going back in the fridge for 24 hours, and we will smoke it tomorrow. This is what the sausage rolls look like once they're cooked. I did 2 full batches in the barbecue, and there were like 2 half trays, 2 quarter trays. I think most of them have been eaten by this stage, which is why of the first batch, which is why I'm showing you a half-eaten tray. There was enough for lunch. There was some leftovers for the next day, and there was also 2 Ziploc bags full that were put in the freezer for another meal later on in the month. And they, as I said, they can just be pulled straight out of the freezer and put in the barbecue oven, frozen. I just put a probe in the middle of one in the middle to check the temperatures as they're going, or you can defrost them and cook them from defrost as well, or can be done in a microwave if that's how you like it. I don't like soggy pastry, so I like to have them done in the barbecue. I had a little bit of mince left, but I didn't want to open another packet of pastry. So for those sausage rolls, I'd used a full packet of pastry, which is 10 sheets. So I still had some mince left, but I didn't want to open another packet of pastry. They're really hard to keep once they're open. They dry out on the edges and then they get crumbly, and I don't like it. So I prefer to use a whole pastry pack at a time if I can. If I need to, I will put it in a Ziploc bag, but it just doesn't hold as well as when it's kept in its original packaging, I find. So I decided to cook them up at meatballs. At this point, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with them, but I just needed to cook it up because it was minced and it was pork, and it needed to be cooked up. So I cooked them up as meatballs. I had used the cast iron pan, just cooked off a couple of batches. I wasn't going to use the oven for this small amount sort of thing. I decided that I'd do the ramen that I've been doing, that slightly spicy ramen with we use peanut butter, but it has sesame, you can use sesame paste and the spicy bean paste and the coconut cream and the miso and things like that. So I basically did that ramen that we've been making a lot, and then I did cabbage with it because cabbage is something that we have pretty much the whole 6 weeks, so it works well for us. Sliced up the cabbage, cooked it off a bit. I like to cook it off in batches so that there's some soft, some crunchy. Made the broth up and cooked the cabbage off a bit more. I cooked the Jun Pt6 ramen noodles are the ones that we're really enjoying, so I cooked them off in some boiling water. They only take about 4 minutes. I then put the ramen noodles in the bowl, put a few meatballs on top of it, and then put the broth with the cabbage in it over the top. It was a really tasty meal. It's simple. It's something that I have been making a fair bit, this sort of a ramen soup type thing. I'm really enjoying having it in rotation of the meals now that I've figured it out and am adjusting some different flavor profiles to work for us and things like that. Though I would like to still create some more flavor profiles as well. I keep on leaning on this one as a lot, but it works fairly well. So, and it's a nice quick meal. So that was getting through that pork and some more of that chicken, and then I've got one more day of prep, getting through the rest of that meat and stuff that needs those tenderloins and things like that, and then I'll have a what we eat in a week to show you some of the meals that I created with all of that stuff. So that was today's video, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks guys.